If you work in government and one of your employees is driving a brand new Ferrari, if it's 2024 and they've got a 2024 Ferrari, we've got a problem. Okay, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines and History with me, John Molly. Episode 27. I've got an interesting one for you here. I'm going to hit multiple angles here with this episode. What do I mean? So we're going to talk about headlines. We're going to talk about something that just happened this week. We're going to talk about history. I'm going to give you an example of something that relates to what's happening this week. And then we're going to talk law enforcement because I'm going to read from an indictment. And so I'm going to come at it. This episode is going to have a combination of all of the things that could be a part of normally what we talk about here on Headlines and History and kind of merge it all into one, right? Based on my military experience and foreign affairs experience, right? Serving overseas, as well as 14 years on the job doing law enforcement stuff. Been a part of many indictments myself. So an interesting conversation, I think. We're going to tie things all in together this week. All right. So what I do want to say, as important as it is every week, it's really important. It was really important last week and it's really important this week. I just have to make clear that what we're talking about here is my opinion and my opinion only. I'm not representing anybody from the military or the Department of Defense or New York State or anybody else, right? This is just my opinion. And take it or leave it. You might like it, you might not like it, but I'll give it to you. But it's just mine nonetheless, right? I'm not talking about anybody else or anything else, not representing anyone. This week it was reported the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York made public an indictment bringing charges on an individual by the name of Linda Sun and her husband, who we'll talk about here. I think his last name is Hu. And how she's been working at the behest of the People's Republic of China, and so therefore the Chinese Communist Party, to influence New York State government in a way that benefits China and hurts particularly relationship between the United States, a diplomatic relationship between the United States and Taiwan. This is something that we talk about all of the time on the podcast. We talk about all of these examples, and I give you warnings of what the Chinese government, today's current Chinese government, is doing to interfere in the doings, in the business of the United States, whether that be in a military capacity, whether that be in a cyber capacity. Today we're going to talk about it in a political capacity. But China has plans. The Chinese government has plans to bring itself to a place where it is as powerful and influential as the United States. And in order to do that, it has to make changes that it wants to make globally to benefit itself. And so it has to collect information that isn't theirs, espionage, traditional spying, if you will, right? Human intelligence. It has to build infrastructure in the way that Western, quote unquote, Western wealthy countries do. It has to continue to establish a modern military. They're doing this particularly with the Navy. It has to do all of these things. And in the intelligence field, they're working hard. In this episode here, we're going to talk about how they're doing that, in particular through this one individual, and how it's relevant to us here. Now, I do this podcast out of upstate New York, right? How it's relevant to us here, and how you don't know that if the person that you go to work with might be someone like Linda Sun, and the person that you live next door to might be Linda Sun and her husband. But so as to not make it sound as if we live in some spooky world where there are bad guys everywhere and clowns like it in the sewers, and we're all doomed. espionage, spying, human intelligence operations leave indicators. They sometimes, our adversaries are really good, and it takes a very long time to root some of these people out, to identify who they are and what they're doing. And other times, they're not. And so they leave indicators that something just doesn't smell right about this person's behavior. Something just doesn't look right with how this person operates, how they show up to work, what they do when they're at work. And we live in an environment today where, unfortunately, we have to pay attention to these indicators because it does matter. It relates to and could affect directly our national security. And Governor Hochul and her team found that out. At least we found out that she found out this week. She found out earlier, and we'll get through that when we talk about the indictment. But she found that out very acutely because it happened to her. Okay, so what's the story? The story is that the Eastern District of New York, so the U.S. Attorney's Office down in New York City, made public their indictment. And the indictment alleges that this individual by the name of Linda Sun, and it'll be tangentially related to her husband, he's brought up and charged in the indictment as well. But really the focus is on Linda. That she was working at the behest of some, I don't want to call them handlers because that makes it sound as if they were orchestrating completely what she was doing. And it seems more, when you read the indictment, and I've read the whole thing, when you read the indictment, it sounds more mutually beneficial than it does necessarily them, the PRC folks, being handlers. But, this is just me, again, making an assessment based on the indictment that, as I read it. I don't know all the details. I wasn't involved in the case, right? But that's just how I read it. And Linda was part of state government and what we believe to be Governor Cuomo during his administration, and now Governor Hochul. Governor Hochul held a press conference about this thing, so she clearly has acknowledged that Linda was a part of her administration. But in the indictment, the two individuals I just referenced, Cuomo and Hochul, are referenced as politician one and politician two. And there's legal reasons for that. It might seem silly because everybody knows, right, in the way the language is written in the indictment, that they're clearly talking about the governor. But again, legal reasons why they're not necessarily acknowledging, technically and directly. We're just all kind of assuming and not fighting against the assumption. Okay, but again, from a legal perspective, there's reasons you do that. Nonetheless, so this Linda Sun character, she's working for New York State government from 2012 to 2023. So she's had some time to develop relationships, network, and move her way through some positions. And she advanced in rank, if you will. She went through and started on the lower tier of the employment scale, and then found herself up to a place where she was dealing directly with the governor, right? Particularly Governor Hochul. Right now, in the indictment, I want to get these positions correct, so I'm going to read them. So, and I want just for accuracy's sake, and I want to misspeak. These are some long titles, but I want to give you an idea of where she started and where she ended up. Okay, so from 2012, let's look here. She started as the Director of Asian American Affairs and Queens Regional Representative for the then executive head, politician one, an individual whose identity is known to the grand jury, from in and around August 2012 to February 2015. Okay, so, like I said, we believe politician one to be Governor Cuomo. Just leave it at that. And she was Asian American Affairs and Queens Regional Representative to then executive head, politician one. Okay, that's a relatively minor position. Now, let me say tangentially here, or parenthetically would be a better way to say it, that it says here in the indictment that the individual's name is known to the grand jury. That can be the case, right? The grand jury is a secret group of people. It's a secret process in a secret group of people. And that's because, for those of you that aren't too familiar with how grand juries and trials in the system works, the grand jury is not a determiner. They do not determine guilt or innocence. The grand jury is only a step in the process that determines whether probable cause exists for an arrest based on charges brought by the prosecutors. So when a police officer arrests someone, let's say they arrest someone on the side of the street for assault, right? They witness an assault. They file what is called a felony complaint. They arrest the person. They file a felony complaint, and they write inside of the felony complaint the behavior that was committed, what was witnessed by the police officer, what happened, right? All the 5 W's. And then they file it with the court. They say, here's my probable cause. I'm a witness. There was another witness. There's marks on this person, whatever. And they add it all together. And they believe they had probable cause for an arrest. It's probably true that person committed that crime. After that, and there's two ways to get into a grand jury, but I'll just say one. After that, they take the felony complaint and they file it with the grand jury. Okay. And so then the individuals who were involved from the prosecution side, the police officer, witnesses, whoever, they all go in front of a grand jury and they testify. They bring evidence and they bring their own witness statements, which is testimony in and of itself. And they explain to the grand jury everything that happened. The grand jury can ask questions. They can file subpoenas. They're called grand jury subpoenas. They can say, yeah, but I want, you didn't bring me the security camera. The grand jurors can literally say this. You didn't bring the security camera on the corner from that marketplace. I want that security camera footage. And they can file a subpoena and get that footage and add it to their pile of evidence and then make a decision. But again, that decision is not guilt or innocence. That decision is whether there's enough probable cause to arrest. So the police officer filed the felony complaint. They said there was probable cause. You give it to the grand jury. The grand jury agrees. Now you have a full indictment. The indictment says there's reason to believe with probable cause that you committed this crime. Okay. That's a post-action grand jury. Then you have a prior action grand jury, which acts more like or either prior action or concurrent action. The investigation's happening at the same time, where police officers and prosecutors, they bring evidence in front of a grand jury, give them all of this information, and ask the grand jury to determine if there's probable cause for an arrest based on whatever charges are being brought. And the grand jury will say yes or no. They will either say yes or they will file a no bill, which means they're saying no. And the case goes away until you bring it again to a grand jury if you have new evidence, but nonetheless. And then you take that information and you go file it with a court and you get an arrest warrant. You go arrest the person. And that's what happened to Linda's son. And you can read through the indictment. It starts all the way back in 2012. And all of these actions were taken and all of this evidence was gathered. And then clearly at the end of all of these explanations, the grand juror said, boy, there's enough information there for an arrest. You may now go and arrest Linda's son. And that's what happened. Okay. I give you all that explanation to say that that's why it says in the indictment that the identity of politician one is known to the grand jury. So they knew when they were making their decisions as to whether Linda's son was what they believe committed enough. There's enough information. There's enough evidence to believe that Linda's son is potentially guilty of these crimes, that they got the name given to them. Maybe they needed the name in order to determine if the charge, as it's written in the law, has been committed. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we get to know, because again, the grand jury is a secret process. Okay, so second position, Director of External Affairs of Global New York for Empire State Development. the economic development arm of the New York State government from in or around April 2015 to February 2018. Okay, so kind of a lateral move, I would say there. I'm not an expert in all positions in New York State government, but it doesn't seem like it's, well, she was the director of external affairs. So let's say that's an upgrade. Next position, Deputy Chief Diversity Officer for Politician 1 from in or about to February 2018 to July 2020. So you're talking about COVID. Then she was Superintendent for Intergovernmental Affairs and Chief Diversity Officer at the New York State Department of Financial Services from July 2020 to September 2021. Okay. Then Deputy Chief of Staff for the New York State Executive Chamber, quote unquote, the Executive Chamber. Everyone calls it the Chamber. Working as an advisor for a then executive head, Politician 2, an individual whose identity is known to the grand jury. I think we believe we know who that is. From in or about September 2021 till September 2022. And then finally, the Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Business Development for the New York State Department of Labor from September 22 until March 2023 when she was fired. And we'll talk about how that all came up. So those are the positions that she held in New York State. I said to you that her husband is involved as well. He's mentioned in the indictment. His name's Chris Hu. He's also a defendant, like I said. He just goes by Chris Hu. Now Linda also goes by Wen Sun, Ling Da Sun, and Linda Hu. So she has some aliases there. And you know, if you're doing what she's doing, then maybe you want a few of those. But now the husband, he operated some businesses throughout New York. He had a seafood exporter business in Queens. He had a financial consultancy in New York City as well, I believe was also in Queens. He had a wine and liquor business down in Queens. And one of his companies was an authorized freight agent of the People's Republic of China. Okay. So so what did she do? Why are we even having this conversation? Well, as the indictment alleges, Sun was involved in doing whatever she could to try and she tried to keep the highest levels of New York State government from interacting with the political representatives of Taiwan, which ultimately benefits the PRC. And so, you know, if you've heard anything about this case in the media recently, you likely heard that a Chinese spy was arrested and they were conducting espionage, and this is a huge deal. And, you know, as if there was like some James Bond character walking around the governor's office. And while this is a big deal in the sense that this is direct access to a senior politician within the United States, it really isn't spying. The term espionage is not brought up in the indictment. She's not been charged, nor has her husband, with espionage. Espionage meaning that she's taking information from the United States and giving it back to the Chinese in a way that would damage directly national security. She's not going into the governor's office late at night and copying classified material, as if the governor often has access to that anyways, but nonetheless, or taking the governor's personal contacts and sending them back to the PRC so the PRC can conduct surveillance on all of Governor Hochul's, colleagues. That isn't the behavior that she was involved in. What she was doing was when opportunities came up for Governor Hochul or members of her staff at some level to engage in some dialogue with representatives of Taiwan from DC to come up to New York, that she would work to block that. That she would say to her staff, she being Linda, would say to her staff, this is not a good idea. I advise against this. We don't want to wade into these international waters. We should leave this to the State Department. This is not for us to do. And what it looks like in reading the indictment is that eventually the continued responses from Linda as to what New York State should not be doing in terms of its connections with the Taiwanese representatives, and how they should be more engaging and in more direct contact with the PRC. That there was enough of those things where somebody probably said something, because you'll see as we'll talk about that there were some interviews with the FBI way before any arrests were made. So what does it say specifically in the indictment? I want to read a couple of these. She was charged with, or not let me not use the word charge, because I'm going to give you the charges at the end, but she's been described as doing, I guess is a better way, right? In a summary format, blocking representatives of the Taiwanese government from having access to the New York State governor's office, right? That's not a crime in and of itself, but this is a description of what her behavior was. We'll get to the crimes. Changing Politician 1 and Politician 2's messaging regarding issues of importance to the PRC and the CCP. Obtaining official New York State governor proclamations for PRC government representatives without proper authorization. Attempting to facilitate a trip to the PRC by Politician 2. Again, our assumption is Governor Hochul. And arranging meetings for visiting delegations from the PRC government with New York State government officials. Those are the 5 descriptors, if you will, of the things that she was doing. Additionally, the indictment goes on to say that that Linda Sun, the defendant, repeatedly violated internal rules and protocols within the New York State governor's office to provide improper benefits to the PRC and CCP representatives, including by providing unauthorized invitation letters from the office of the New York State government that were used to facilitate travel by PRC government officials into the United States for meetings with the New York State government officials. Now, this was brought up in Governor Hochul's press conference, where she had referred to, and if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's like 10 minutes. It's quasi-informative, but nonetheless, she brought up in there that one of the behaviors that Linda was involved in is that she, with the intent to deceive, signed invitations using Governor Hochul's signature. Clearly, she didn't do that. And as it says in the indictment, and in order to get PRC officials here into the United States. Now, on a purely political, she forged the signature, bottom line. On a purely political standpoint, right, clearly that's wrong, right? We're not going to have a discussion here as to why that might not be that big of a deal, but what I'm trying to say here is that if she brought some PRC officials over here and they came to New York City and they kind of went to a dinner, a conference dinner or something, whatever. I mean, okay. And then they went back and, how much damage could that have really caused? But what we don't know, and there's a lot of things from this indictment we don't know, and we shouldn't. There's probably multiple other investigations going on that branched off from this and other things. But when you invite people from the PRC who you don't know what their intentions are, when you bring them here into New York City or anywhere else in New York State under the legal guise of the United States, meaning that you have, you've now facilitated travel under state authority to come here. Who knows who they brought with them? Did they bring a team of folks that love planting cameras and speakers everywhere they go? I mean, I don't want that to come across as like too much of a conspiracy spy novel type suggestion. But nonetheless, that's the kind of stuff that governments do, right? It's a lot easier to bring a couple of fellas as part of your political delegation that are your handlers that you claim are just here to carry your laundry around, but in actuality are tech investigators or technically savvy intelligence collectors who are here to gather even more information. That's how these games work. That's how these processes work. You start small, you find little cracks in the defense, if you will, and then you start taking your shots. And if you can get yourself on a plane and get into New York and get yourself close to the governor in some sense, then who knows what you're doing in a hotel room? Who knows what you're doing to collect on some other folks? Now this is where we get into some of the law breaking, right? It's certainly against the law to forge the governor's signature, right? So there's a charge, there's a crime. Then you have some of the kickbacks that came from this, and this is what makes it very clear that she was working at the behest of the PRC, and and how some of these indicators that something may be going on, and particularly if you're working in government. And some of these indicators can be a little bit easier to see than others. And sometimes foreign intelligence collectors are really good at what they do. I mean, you can read the stories from the Cold War where people that were known to be Russian spies, as just as an example, working for the Soviets, made their way into Canada or the United States and were never found. We knew that they came, right? We discovered some documents, for example, and I don't remember any specific cases off the top of my head. I know that I've read about them. I just can't remember their names or whatever. But that the CIA, for example, found out that there are some irregulars, they called them, that are here, but we don't know exactly who they are, and they were never found. They could be somebody that just kind of stayed the rest of their life in the United States. It doesn't matter. Okay. The point is that this is the kind of stuff that does happen. Okay. But anyways, she and her husband, right, they laundered a bunch of money through his businesses. They did some financial work here in the indictment. They don't get into too much detail as to how they did that, but they don't need to. They talked about how they were able to identify some of this money laundering stuff. And they purchased real estate in Manhasset, New York. 3.9 million in New York is the approximate value. They had a condominium in Hawaii worth about 1.9 million. Various luxury automobiles, if you read in the indictment, there's a Mercedes, one of which is a 2024 Ferrari. And of course, Linda never disclosed any of these things to the New York State Ethics Panel, which is a requirement for people working in positions in government that affect policy. Now, when I was working for the Attorney General's office, this is how serious they take it in the state, and they should. But based on my position, and I was just a lowly investigator, right? You couldn't get any lower than me in that sense, right? Like nobody worked for me, and I worked for everybody else. But New York State saw that because of the authority that I wielded, being law enforcement and conducting organized crime investigations and who knows where that could go, that I could potentially in some way affect policy within New York State government. I don't know how anybody would have thought I could do that directly, but maybe indirectly in some way with whatever we were doing. I don't know. But nonetheless, I had to file a financial disclosure every year. I mean, they clearly knew what I was making from New York State. But if I had any other jobs, I had to disclose that. And then any of my investments, whatever I was doing financially, up to a certain point, I had to tell the government every year. And then they would use that. They wouldn't necessarily do anything with it, but if they found anomalies, then they would ask questions, because I could be in a position to be manipulated potentially, or again, I could affect policy. So anybody that's in that world, either because of the rank that you hold, like Linda did, if you have access to the governor, you can clearly affect policy, or by the authority that you wield, then you've got to disclose these things. And working on a New York State salary and driving a 2024 Ferrari is one of the things you should disclose. Now what I was saying earlier is that this is an investigation that's potentially been going on for a long time. And that's because it says early on in the indictment that she was interviewed by the FBI in July of 2020. A voluntary interview that she described some of the trips that she was taking back to the PRC, and she wasn't truthful. And so I'm sure that led to the investigation continuing. Now, again, I have no idea how the case started. I have no idea. It could be a whole slew of ways, right? Somebody could have reported her that was working with her and said, hey, she's always telling the governor she travels to China for personal reasons, but I know she went for work. Who knows, right? I don't. Could have been that our intelligence collectors were collecting on foreign adversaries, and somehow Linda Sun got herself in some way caught up in that. That sure, her email pops up one day and she's talking to some guy in Beijing, and somebody that the U.S. intelligence agencies are paying attention to, and he's emailing Linda Sun, and it wouldn't be the FBI in that case, but it would be the CIA or NSA, whoever was doing the work, was like, who's this Linda Sun character? And then they do a little digging and they figure out, oh boy, what does this person work for? So that could be how it happened. I have no idea, and they're not going to tell us. And again, nor should they, but it could have been any one of these ways, and an investigation started. So clearly the FBI decided in July 2020 that the best investigative route would be to interview her. And maybe they were looking to see if that she would be truthful or not. I'm sure the FBI did not go in and start laying their cards on the table. That's not what they did. But I'm sure they had whatever information they had, again, from an informant or whatever. And they said, well, let's just see. I mean, let's just verify if maybe we're wrong, or maybe the informant's wrong. And then they sit her down and they say, hey, did you go to Beijing last year? And she says no. And indicator number one, right? Now you have more reason to believe that maybe she's doing some things that she shouldn't be doing. And on she goes with the investigation, or on they go with the investigation, rather. Now let's dig into some of these specific claims, right? So in the beginning here, I was just talking about some generalized behavior, right? She wasn't committing espionage. She wasn't stealing secrets per se, right? She wasn't taking classified information and posting on her Discord channel, right? Like some of our military members tend to do. Anyways, but she was certainly affecting what was happening in state government. So let's look at these. Let's look at these in particular. It's not everything, right? We'll be here all night if we read the whole indictment. But as I'm recording here and on the evening of September 9th, right on Monday night. So the one entity here, and this is going to go through. This entity here is going to be found throughout multiple instances when she was involved in things she shouldn't be. It's called the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States, TECRO. Sometimes referred to as TECO, but it's a de facto unofficial embassy that operates out of Washington, D.C. Okay, so the whole point of this China versus the United States issue, and it's not just the United States, but others, is the fact that after World War II, and I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, but it's the fact that after World War II, China had a civil war, and Mao won. And Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist, more democratic-leaning Chinese citizens, which was actually the official government of China, lost the civil war. And Chiang Kai-shek took his government and his followers and his people and headed off to Formosa, which was what was Taiwan was referred to back then. If you read the World War II literature, Eisenhower and others, they're constantly referring to Formosa. And we just call it Taiwan today. But anyways, and so you had a dual government setup. You had the winners of the Civil War in Beijing, Mao and his communists, and you had what was technically the official government that headed off to Taipei in Taiwan. And now you have a split ruling, if you will. And what the United States and the West decided to do for a lot of reasons, one, we were dealing with the Soviet Union. Again, one, from a foreign policy perspective, we were dealing with the Soviet Union. And China was nowhere near a concern as much as the Soviet Union was at that point. China, and this plays into the whole strategic issues of China. China was a country that was far and away not in China was far behind the technological advances of of Europe, the United States, the Soviet Union, Japan, and many others, Australia, many others in the 20th century, which became a real issue, which it's still an issue today for President Xi, and it was one of the issues with Mao and the reason that he wanted to conduct the civil war and to kick Chiang Kai-shek out and all these other things. But nonetheless, so we didn't pay as much attention to China at the time, post World War II, other than Korea. But again, that was more about the communist spread and the Soviet Union really than it was about China. But nonetheless, the decision was made to recognize, because Mao did technically win the Civil War, was to recognize Mao as it, and it is recognized as the official government of China, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, which is the government that Mao stood up. But at the same time, knowing full well that Chiang Kai-shek and his people that went to Taiwan are much more democratic leaning and would certainly have a closer connection to the West in that way, that we weren't going to disregard them. So we in the United States specifically, we push for a one China policy, and that's the official policy of the United States today, because we do recognize China or the PRC as the official government in Beijing, and we don't have direct diplomatic relations with Taiwan in the same legal way we do with China because of that. Because we're pushing for a one China policy. We're not going to recognize Taiwan as an independent country because China has asked us not to, and it's just not the time and the place to do that. So you'll hear often where we're saying things like, we would love for Taiwan to be able to flourish and for Beijing and Taipei to figure out how they could flourish together. But we don't call for an independent Taiwan because that'll really just set the Chinese off. So what we do is we walk the line. We have this gray line, and we have political conversations and political discussions with Taiwan, but we don't have official diplomatic relationships. There is no embassy for Taiwan in the United States because Taiwan's not a country, technically. And so other countries, Taiwan's not just one of them, but they do things like set up the Economic and Cultural Representative Office within the United States. And then we can have discussions with them and talk about, the things that Taiwan would love to do someday, whatever, right? And you may have heard, was it last year, 2 years ago, a couple years ago, when Speaker of the House Pelosi, she was the highest ranking delegation to ever go to Taiwan. The president's never gone because that would be like an official no-no, right? If the president goes and meets with a leader of another place, that's like considering that other place an official country. So we don't send the president. The president doesn't deal with the president of Taiwan in that way. But we did send the the Speaker of the House, third highest ranking politician in the United States. So by sending Speaker Pelosi over there, that was sending a message to China, to Beijing, that the United States is serious about its potential relationship with Taiwan. But again, we don't call for their independence. The games we play in the diplomatic world. But nonetheless, so Linda Sun is working to hinder any type of connection between the New York State government and this TECRO organization, because she clearly wants a stronger relationship between the PRC. And the PRC is not interested in the United States having any type of connection with Taiwan or anybody that it represents. Or anybody that represents them, rather. So on one occasion, Sun had bragged that she had stopped both Politician 1 and Politician 2, remember who they are, Politician 1 and 2, from having a meeting with TECRO. And I don't recall, it doesn't say in the indictment whether that was an email or what it was. But as a result, Sun was provided things like concert tickets, travel. There's even a part here about salted ducks believe it or not, which was actually written inside of the indictment. So clearly, at one point, she had taken salted ducks and from PRC handlers, from the personal chef, it says here in the indictment, and just as a way to um, prove that she was doing what she was doing. This is one of my favorite parts about reading indictments like this, because sometimes you're not going to hear about this funny stuff in the media. The media is going to draw out the obvious and the stuff that's like that's the flashy, right? We talk about the Ferrari, that's flashy. It's important, it's flashy. But what about the salted ducks? It kind of reminds me of my one of my funniest stories from my time on the job working organized crime, where I and I'll tell the story in full at another time, but and I did bring it up in the Ian Bick podcast if you watch that, but where we were able to indict somebody who we believed at one point was an unknown male. We had no idea who he was. We had, and when I say no idea, I mean like individually. I didn't know his name. I didn't know exactly where he lived, and we knew it was a male who lived in the Bronx and was selling drugs. We knew that, and we had some idea what he looked like, but we didn't know who he was. But nonetheless, we didn't know until he made a phone call to Pepperidge Farms asking about brownies, and we were wiretapping his phone, and he ended up buying himself 12 years in prison because he wanted to know about brownies. But these are like little things that happen inside investigations that you just can't make up, right? I mean, salted ducks. So there's one notable event here that it states, on or about 21 June 2016, politician 2 attended a 2016 Select USA reception in Washington, D.C., hosted by the PRC Embassy and the China General Chamber of Commerce, USA, rather than an event hosted by Taiwan. That's, in a nutshell, exactly what Linda Sun was trying to do. She was trying to keep the people that she was working for from doing normal business with Taiwan, which would strengthen relations in some way. Now, one thing I thought was pretty interesting that I'll tease out here from the indictment that indicates to me there's no wiretap information in this indictment. Or let me state it this way, that there's no wiretap evidence being used now, is that in here on July 10th, 2019, the indictment lists a telephone call that was approximately 9 minutes, but it doesn't describe any content. And then it says another phone call that lasted approximately 2.5 minutes with a specific PRC official. There's no name in here. It just says PRC official 4. And then an email message with content. Quote, I wanted to check if there's a particular event in the system, end quote. This is what Linda was saying to the PRC official number 4. So there's no phone content. So what that says to me is they're only presenting what is called the metadata content. Or the metadata. They're not that they got from either telephone tolls, sometimes called LUDs, but from tolls. And they looked at the phone numbers and they said, okay, this phone talked to that phone for 9 minutes, but we have no idea what they said. And the same is for the second phone. We have no idea, or the second phone call. It was 2.5 minutes and they have no idea what we said. But the third connection was via email, and we have the email and here's the content. Now, let me make clear here. I'm not saying that the federal government did not wiretap Linda Sun or did not wiretap the PRC official from a foreign intelligence collection perspective. I have no idea. It's possible. It's not possible. Who knows? All I'm saying is that evidence, if it does exist, is not in this indictment. If it does exist, there could be a couple of reasons for that. They don't need it. There's no reason for them to provide the content here. Maybe they did do it and they don't want anybody to know they did. I mean, who knows? It could be a whole host of things. But clearly what they do have is the content from the emails. Now here's one that's kind of interesting that I thought was a bit more damaging. And this was on March 16th, 2020. So we're talking about the beginning of COVID in the sense where it started to become real, right? COVID started, clearly we know, it was on the news and people were talking about it in January of 2020. But I remember particularly when I went overseas to Kuwait in 2020, it was March 3rd, I think we left. Nonetheless, and it was a few days or something or whatever. It was the first couple of weeks of March that when we got downrange and everything started shutting down. I remember talking to my wife, like everything was starting to shut down. So March of 2020, this is in the thick of, oh man, this thing is really becoming serious all over the place, where she set up a phone call and didn't tell anybody. The phone call was between Taiwanese representatives and the state government because Taiwan had just donated 200,000 masks in support of, COVID. And Linda Sun couldn't stop that from happening. So she wanted to do damage control. So a phone call was set up, and she allowed this PRC, specifically PRC official number 4, to be on the phone call, but she didn't tell anybody. So New York State officials are on here, Taiwanese officials are on here, and she surreptitiously let somebody else listen in, clearly from the Chinese government. So that is, to me, a step forward in terms of her illegality. One thing, you tell the governor not to talk to somebody from Taiwan. You'd rather talk to somebody at China and go to one dinner over another dinner. Yes, that's bad behavior. We don't want that. But that's like one level. Another level is to have somebody literally listening on a phone call that no one knows that they're there. Who knows what kind of discussions could be had between New York State and Taiwan. And I'm sure that phone call was recorded. Not because I know literally, but come on, let's be serious here. That phone call was likely recorded and then sent back to the CCP in some way, right? Some of their intelligence agency, and they're listening to the thing and they're trying to piece together what it means and if there's anything they can glean from that. That to me is a big deal. Another thing that she did was she worked really hard to ensure that the Uyghur scenario was never brought up in any discussions between, again, New York officials and Chinese officials if they were to happen, or to be brought up in any scenario at any time. So we all know by reading the news and what we know about the Uyghurs that it's a sensitive topic for the Chinese. They really do not like these Turkic Muslims that live in the northwest of China. They don't like them from an ethnic standpoint. There are actually, a lot of people don't know this, there are actually ethnically Chinese Muslims in the northwest of China called the Hui, Hui, and they don't get anywhere near the backlash that the Uyghurs get. Well, the Uyghurs are Turkic. They're not Chinese. So it's not necessarily the Muslim thing, even though clearly China is a Confucian society, but nonetheless, it's not so much Islam. It's really about the ethnicity. But anyways, Linda was working to ensure that we weren't having any conversations. New York State was not having any conversations about the Uyghurs. Now, she used the excuse that the Uyghur topic is not something for New York State to be getting involved in, that it's not for the governor of New York to have a conversation about something that doesn't directly affect her, and it's more of a federal government thing. And so that makes kind of some sense. So people accepted that. But anyways, it's just another avenue, another way of her continuously trying to work in support of PRC talking points. And another big one was what we had already mentioned when she forged the governor's signature so PRC folks could show up in the United States. So in the indictment, they're like listing these events. And then if you read the indictment, if you're a nerd like me, if you read the indictment, you'll see that there's all the evidence that supports each one of these claims. They're multiple pages long, and it shows you how the government knew and how the feds are using that to charge her. And then there was the whole kickback scheme, and I mentioned some of them, but there's more to this. So let's get into some of the details here. She bought multiple luxury automobiles. One was a Mercedes, as I had said, and one was a 2024 Ferrari Roma. She laundered the money through her husband's businesses. She had having payments made directly from the PRC to the U.S. bank accounts created by her husband in the name of Sun's close relative, and the relative's not identified here in the indictment. But the interesting part is that the relative had no idea. So this was a fake bank account, not fake bank accounts, bank accounts that were created, opened by Linda in her relative's name, but never told the relative. She did a lot of layered activity, meaning she was moving money between personal and business accounts back and forth in a way to both structure and then hide what she was doing. Right? She was trying to obfuscate. It's a typical tactic in the money laundering world, trying to obfuscate which money is dirty money and which money is clean money. And you do that by trying to, again, push back and forth your savings to your checking and then over to this business account and then this business account and that business account. And the hope is that you can't match this dollar to that dollar to this dollar. And then, where does it all lead? And then hopefully it's just becomes so confusing and convoluted that you can't prove dollar A was, again, related to illegal business and dollar B wasn't. The real estate in New York City, about 4 million. I think earlier I said 3.9, right? So like a 4 million. The condominium in Hawaii, Ocean View, 47th floor in Honolulu, valued at like 2.1 million. I think I said 1.9 earlier, but like 2.1. No mortgages, all bought cash. Didn't report any of the real estate transactions to the New York State Ethics Panel. Now, I said in the outset, right, if somebody that works for the government is driving a Ferrari, that's an indicator. It's potentially true that nobody knew she was driving a Ferrari. Let's be honest, right? I mean, it's a point to be made, but who knows? And nobody may have known that she owned the apartment in Hawaii and in New York City, right? She could have kept that to herself, and only she and her husband knew. And with all the money that was coming in from China, from the PRC, that she could have had some regular apartment or regular house in Albany or something. I have no idea, but then everyone thought that she just was a regular person doing regular things, and she wasn't flaunting this money in terms of any connection with her, in her doings with the PRC. So it's an unfair, admittedly, it's an unfair point to make, but in terms of this instance, but it does remain true that not every intelligence collector from another country is brilliant. Not everything they do is really smart. Sometimes they do silly things. Sometimes they do really obvious things. Drug dealers, sometimes they buy really expensive cars, without the money to pay for them, and they stand out like a sore thumb. Maybe somebody's driving a car, they have undue affluence, and they're driving a car that they certainly shouldn't be driving on a $100,000 a year salary or whatever it is. So, and maybe too, again, not part of the investigation, maybe they did know. And maybe one of the reasons that the FBI came and talked to Linda is because that she was driving cars way above her pay scale, and somebody was like, boy, this doesn't smell right. And, and the feds come knocking. All right. So what ultimately is she charged with? I want to get through this here before we get to our historical example, because it's kind of actually really interesting, something to talk about that I think is again interesting. So 10 counts. All right. So count 1 here, conspiracy to violate the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So that you may have heard of all over the place. It happens sometimes in Congress. There was actually just a Congressman Mendez, I think. Mendez, something from New Jersey, who was found guilty of doing the same thing. He was taking gifts and I don't want to call them bribes, but I don't know what the official language is in his case in particular, but he was definitely taking money and didn't register it as a foreign agent, so he should have done that. That's a violation. Count 2 here, failure to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So she didn't register and she violated. She did visa fraud. That's third count. Count 4 through 7, bringing in aliens. So 4 through 7, 4, 5, 6, 7. In the indictment, there are 4 individuals named PRC 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have no idea who they are, but there's where your 4 counts come from. So every time you bring somebody in that doesn't belong into the United States, then that's an illegal alien charge. So that's where her 4 come from. Count 8, conspiracy to commit bank fraud. That's probably the check. Count 9, misuse of means of identification. That probably relates to the check. And count 10, money laundering conspiracy. So it's a conspiracy charge. So that means that she's obviously conspiring with someone else, and there's another act that's involved in that. So there's probably some charge that maybe went to her husband, and he's been charged with the money laundering because it's easier to put the charge on him for whatever reason, because it's his businesses and his bank accounts. So he's charged with it, and then she's charged with the conspiracy on top of it. So that's her 10th charge. Again, I don't know any of these things, but just based on my experience, it's what it sounds like. And they're also going to seek forfeiture, which is another thing they have to put in the indictment. And they did. And so what they do is they describe in the indictment why they want to forfeit, or they're going to seek forfeiture of the earnings or materials that were gained during the illegal behavior. And so they said, well, we're going to take your car because of these reasons, and we're going to take your house because of these reasons, and here's why we can prove the car is not yours and the house is not yours, or not yours legally, and here's why this cash in this bank account you can't keep, and all these things. And that's all written in there as well. So she's not only going to go to prison, is my guess. Again, this is just an indictment. She's certainly legally allowed to go to trial and defend herself and claim that none of these things are true. I'm going to make the guess that that's going to be a very long uphill battle for her. It seems it's a pretty well written indictment. There's a lot in here, and so I think she's up against it. But we'll see nonetheless, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. One thing I do want to make clear too, and I just mentioned it a couple of minutes ago, but I want to say it again. It is because I don't want to leave you with the idea that I'm somehow picking on Governor Hochul and her staff because of this behavior. I'm not doing that because I don't know what happened. I don't know what Linda's son was doing every day at work. I don't know if she ever drove the Ferrari there. I don't know any of those things. And so it's possible she did a pretty good job of covering her tracks, and maybe she just did seem like somebody who was looking out for the best of the state, for the state's best interests, and was intelligent and was saying, listen, it's just not the state's business to meddle inside of what are traditionally federal within the federal lane. And so we're staying away from the whole China thing, and that certainly could be the case. All I'm saying is that if the indicators were there, if she drove her Ferrari to a summer work picnic and everybody saw it, if colleagues dropped her off at night after a long day to her $4 million condo, if the colleagues knew that she was going to her $2 million condo in Honolulu and some of this stuff just didn't add up, I'm sure she was making claims that her husband was unbelievably wealthy and that's where all the money came from. Who knows? But nonetheless, when the indicators are there, we should pay attention. And we certainly live in the see something, say something world. And just like we did after 9/11 when it came to the terrorism issue, and it still relates today, right? See something, say something, of course. But from a counterintelligence espionage perspective, it's just as relevant today as it ever has been. And so if something just doesn't smell right, it doesn't sound right, then, maybe we say something, because you never know. But anyways, let me give you let's go into history here. We'll see what happens with Linda Sue. But again, my thought is that she's cooked, as my son would like to say, and laughs at me when I say. Sometimes your adversaries work hard to influence your behavior to benefit themselves. Sometimes your friends do it. They work to influence your behavior to benefit yourselves, or benefit themselves, rather. And this happened during World War II with our bestest friends, the Brits. If you didn't know, there was something called the British Security Coordination. We just called it the BSC. And basically, this was a counter-espionage and intelligence agency that was a compartment of the British Secret Intelligence Service, so the SIS. And the whole purpose of the BSC was to influence politicians and the American public. The whole purpose of the BSC was to influence politicians and the American public to join World War II. Now, in the beginning, we all know, right? 1939 is the beginning, the technical beginning of World War II when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and then into Poland. But the United States didn't get involved until after Pearl Harbor, December 7th, the day that'll forever live in infamy, right? 1941. And it took a few years for the United States to get into the mix. And much like World War I, there was a huge percentage of the public that was not interested in getting involved in a European war that didn't have any direct relationship to the United States. Where you can call them isolationists. That's the common term that was used then. It's the term that's being used today for those that don't want to support Ukraine and think Ukraine has nothing to do with the United States and doesn't want to spend the money. These are the same arguments that happened in World War I and the same arguments that happened in World War II. And some of them are, they're not completely illogical. Particularly with World War I, if you're to do a comparison between the two, I'll say that, it seemed less likely that World War I could have any real lasting effect on the United States. We weren't a global world power at that point. And these are empires. They were still empires in World War I. There were the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburgs and the German Empire. They're all fighting each other in Europe over these, really, right? The catalyst is a dead guy in Sarajevo, but back and forth. And, Woodrow Wilson and the rest of the United States are thinking to themselves, well, is it really worth it to send American Joes over there for what? So one European or, empire can have more authority than another. And arguably it's a little different in World War II because there was the idea that Hitler really wanted to take over the world. But nonetheless, the point is, at some points during the Second World War, prior to the United States getting involved, there were some polls, 80% of the United States people, the U.S. people, the Americans, they did not want to get involved. 80%. And the Brits knew, Churchill in particular, knew that the Brits, the French, they were not going to make it if it wasn't for the United States. And it wasn't that we were some kind of military power in the same sense that we are today. It was because we had money in manufacturing. And they knew it. Churchill knew it. They needed the United States to bring its manufacturing power and its money and its goods into the fight, or it was going to be a tough win. And they knew that. And that's exactly what happened. And eventually, Japan, right? Pearl Harbor. But for years, the Brits are working to try and convince the American people to jump on board. And that makes sense, right? Because if FDR had made clear to Churchill on numerous occasions, I don't want to join the war, not because I don't love you, but because, and I don't think and I think Hitler's a good guy for some reason, but most of the American people don't think it's a good idea. And at the end of the day, FDR is a politician. And he made it clear to Roosevelt. He said, I just don't have the support. I don't have the support in Congress. They're not going to declare war. Nobody has attacked the United States directly. And I just don't have the support. That's kind of how democracies work. So Churchill being, and from Churchill's perspective, what is he thinking? Well, all he cares about, I don't want to say it that way, not all he cares about, but his primary goal is the continued existence of Britain, of England in particular. So what is he to do? Well, he's got to look at his plans, and he's got to look at his military capacity, and he's going to say, well, listen, I might not make it out of this thing alive. So, I get that Roosevelt doesn't have the support, but that's not my problem. My problem is saving the British Empire. And the only way that I think I could really do that is to get Roosevelt involved. So how do I do it? Well, I'll keep calling Roosevelt and I'll keep asking him. And then Roosevelt will keep saying, Winston, I understand, but there's nothing I can do. And then Winston says, hey, how do we do this in another way? The BSC becomes one of the ways that Churchill is able to get this done. So he hires William Stevenson. Okay, this is a Canadian. He's originally from Winnipeg, and he was appointed by Churchill to head this organization specifically out of New York City, but it would work within North America. So there's a Canada relation here too, other than that's where he's from. And his official title was he was a passport control officer. But obviously, we come to find out he was really in control of 2,000 agents doing a whole bunch of things, really interesting things. He had 5 main goals that or lines of effort, let's call them, that he was given. Okay, he was to represent British intelligence interests in North America. He was to facilitate Lend-Lease program from the U.S. to Britain, which ended up happening, and thankfully for Britain, right? Provide valuable advice and training to the fledgling American intelligence community. That's also very true. The Brits were we didn't have the CIA at this point. This was the early years of OSS and Office of Strategic Services, which really stood up during the war and whatever. So the U.S. was certainly behind our British counterparts in intelligence collection. Influenced the USA away from isolationism to internationalism, and then just basically just serve as a liaison between Britain and the United States. The organization occupied the 35th and 36th floors at in Rockefeller Center down in New York, and it had a whole bunch of employees there doing confidential administration stuff. A lot of them were females, running sources and doing a whole bunch of things. Stevenson worked pretty closely with Wild Bill Donovan. So here's a connection to New York again. Colonel and then eventually General Donovan, who he knew since World War I. And they were working together to determine, to build a plan as to how the United States could eventually help Britain in the war. You know, Donovan was supportive of Britain in fighting against Hitler. There were many people that were. Not everybody in the United States was isolationist. There were plenty in the military who who understood the threat that Hitler was. And it's kind of interesting that Donovan was called Big Bill and Stevenson was called Little Bill because Donovan was really tall and Stevenson was kind of short, so they had Big and Little Bill. And some of the things that they did, they're kind of neat that the BSC did to try to convince, to just manipulate the environment, right? So in one instance, for example, they created this made up Hungarian astrologer, Louis de Waal. Doesn't really matter his name, but anyways, they made this astrologer up, and this guy, they paid him to go traveling across the United States to tell everyone that Hitler was going to die because the stars told him he was going to die. And the reason they did that was because Hitler believed in astrology himself. He was a big astrologer, so he would look up at the sky and the big number, whatever they do. And he said, "Oh man, I've been reading this, and that's it. He's cooked." And so he would go around and tell everybody. It was all made up. It was all nonsense. There was no prediction. First of all, he wasn't even an astrologer. He was an actor. And then, there was no prediction that Hitler was going to die. They had a rumor factory that specifically they just made things up and published it. One of them was that the British had developed a undersea depth charge that would eviscerate U-boats, and the German military believed it, and so they had changed naval plans because of it. They set up a radio station, WRUL, and they attacked Charles Lindbergh pretty relentlessly. Now, Lindbergh, the aviator, was a pretty staunch isolationist. He had traveled the country preaching, if you will. Preaching's probably the right word. Preaching about the perils of joining World War II and how the United States should be focused only on the United States and shouldn't get anywhere near involved. Again, they had something called Station M for Magic in Toronto, where they made up phony documents to, again, influence and change the mindset in the United States. At one point, they created a fake German map, and they used all the right paper and ink and all the things that would make it look authentic. They created a map that supposedly came from Germany, depicting an invasion of South America and how the Germans were planning on doing that, and then gave it to politicians and decision makers within the U.S. So the U.S. would look at it and go, "Oh, well, maybe this is something that we should pay attention to." Brilliant. they would also make up fake polls. They would either use real polls, they would conduct real polls, and then either by changing the questions to point to a certain answer, or by just making up poll data and then giving them to Congress people, they would leave the Congress people with the impression that the United States opinion was changing on support of the war, and that maybe the United States should consider getting involved. And the U.S., the average citizen was looking, saying, hey, maybe this Hitler guy, so and so. So they were actually affecting polling data. They never had anything to do with the elections per se. They weren't like doing any election interference directly in that way, right? They weren't like changing votes or anything like that. But they certainly were making things up out of whole cloth, fake documents, everything the Brits were doing to try and get the United States involved in the war. Now, you can argue whether it worked or whether it didn't work. Who knows? I mean, how much influence did it really have? I think probably it wouldn't have mattered at the end of the day. I mean, I'm sure it had its own influence, but December 7th is what really turned the United States. And the same thing happened on 9/11. I mean, when you attack the United States directly, when there are videos and pictures of sailors burning on the Arizona and Hawaii, and there are people jumping out of buildings in Manhattan, I think it's all safe to say we can all take our political hats off and put them down and say, okay, we're about to have a different discussion here because, all the rhetoric aside, you're now killing Americans and we got a problem. And so that eventually, obviously turned the tide and the U.S. gets involved, and here we go, right? Normandy and D-Day and the whole nine. So, okay, so Linda's son, bad news, indicted by the Eastern District of New York, worked pretty hard to try to keep Governor Hochul and her team from doing business with, the political representatives of the Taiwanese government. Again, not an independent country, but Taiwanese government in D.C. Caught doing so, found the millions, found the Ferrari. She's indicted. She has every right to plead not guilty and fight the charges, but she's got an uphill battle. And nonetheless, it's she wasn't a spy in the technical sense. She wasn't committing espionage, but she was certainly influencing the behavior of our senior politicians. And we got to watch out. This is something that's happening all the time, particularly with China. So, but it's not the only time it's ever happened. We've had this happen in the past, even with our friends the Brits, making up fake maps of South America. So, all right, listen. Thanks for joining me today. A little law enforcement, little foreign affairs, little military conflict. Hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll see what happens with Linda in the future. Head off to headlinesinhistory.com. Venezuela talk coming soon. We're going to be doing the interview shortly. The script is done. We're going to kind of do a script episode with Saratoga. That's coming. I'm talking to my buddy in the UK. Speaking of the Brits, I don't think he's a spy, but you never know. We'll see what happens with the episode. So thanks for joining me today here, and I look forward to talking to everybody next week. See you soon.